Welcome, everyone. I'm Carrie Braverman, Director of the UB Gender Institute and Professor of English here at UB. And before we get started with today's event, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. This is the final week of the academic year, and well, actually the penultimate week, but the final week for Gender Institute programming. And both of our events this week are in collaboration with the law school. Our final Feminist Research Alliance event will feature Baldy postdoctoral fellow Celine Reynolds, who will speak about her research on Title IX and how sexual harassment became sex discrimination in American higher education. And that will be via Zoom this Friday, May 5th at 12 noon. And for those of you online, we're putting a link to that registration in the chat box. Today's event is part of UB Gender Institute's New Books, New Feminist Direction series, which is now in its second year. And it's a way for us to recognize and celebrate a colleague's major achievement and to draw attention to the amazing feminist scholarship happening at the University of Buffalo. Today, we turn to Irus Braverman's Settling Nature, the Conservation Regime in Palestine-Israel. And it really is a book launch in that the book was just published a few weeks ago, and we have a discount code available for attendees today, and we put that code also in the chat box. Braverman's driving question in this very readable book is, how do we decolonize nature? Through ethnographic fieldwork, personal reflections, and environmental history, Braverman tells a powerful story of how the green politics of nature conservation have been weaponized as a way for Israel to dispossess non-Jews of land. For those of us not aware of the politics of parklands, Dr. Braverman's book is a sober wake-up call. After you read the book, you will never enjoy the pastoral image of sheep or the song of goldfinches in the same way again. That's a spoiler alert for everyone. Irus Braverman is professor of law and adjunct professor of geography at UB. She's the author of several books, including Planted Flags, Trees, Land, and Law in Israel, Palestine, Zooland, The Institution of Captivity, and Coral Whisperers, Scientists on the Brink, which you spoke about actually during my first year as director of the Gender Institute. Last year, she published an edited collection, More Than One Health, Humans, Animals, and the Environment Post-COVID with Routledge. She has received several fellowships and awards. In fact, she has just returned from South Africa, where she was a fellow at the prestigious Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study. When I asked Irus whom she would like to invite to offer commentary, she immediately replied, Leila Harris. And I'm delighted that Professor Harris agreed to participate in today's event. Leila Harris is a professor in the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, and also the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. A sociocultural and political geographer, her work connects political ecology, nature, society studies, and issues of sociocultural difference, inequality, and politics. As co-director of the program of water governance, she has investigated water access and water quality in Canada, including for First Nations in British Columbia. She also looks at the gendered relations of water governance in Ghana and South Africa. The format for today's event will be as follows. Professor Braverman will begin with the overview of her book, and then we'll turn to Professor Harris for commentary. And then after a response from Professor Braverman, perhaps a little conversation between the two, we will open up the floor for comments and questions. For those of you viewing this event on Zoom, we ask that you post the questions in the chat box. And for those of you who are here in person, there are refreshments, and feel free to help yourself whenever. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Irus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Carrie, for this really lovely introduction. Thank you, Leila, for making it all the way from Vancouver. So lovely to finally meet you in person after so many years of working together in various contexts. And thank you to the Gender Institute, to Surabhi, to Megan. Thank you to Anita, who's here, my assistant, who's been helping me for so many years. I think probably a decade at this point, probably more. So thank you, Anita, for also being here. I know it's a stressful time. And thank you all for making it at this stage of the semester, and to those of you online as well. I see some familiar faces. So this book had, as a lot of you who are sitting here know, have had a very long pregnancy and a very painful birth. And I'm gonna try to summarize it in, I was asked to do it in a short 20 minutes. And so it is kind of probably a lifetime project, definitely an active decade-long ethnographic project. And the general argument that I make in the book is that nature management is more central to the settler colonial project than is usually recognized. And more specifically, I argue in the context of the Zionist regime that nature administration furthers and advances the project of Jewish settlement alongside the dispossession of non-Jews from this place. So I'm talking about kind of a dual project of settlement on the one hand of the Zionists and of dispossession of the indigenous community in this space, which I call Palestine-Israel, which is kind of unusual. We might be able to get into that, maybe not. So my work tries to encompass two different technologies or strategies for settlement and dispossession. One is something that a lot of you might be familiar with, and that's the more kind of territorial aspect of dispossession and settlement that occurs through the takeover of land and the enclosure of land, specifically through national parks and nature reserves. That is what I kind of call the more sovereign project, if we kind of wink to Foucault. And the more biopolitical project, another wink to Foucault, is a little bit more versatile, perhaps, happens, and this is kind of where my book pushes the envelope a little bit to bring together both the territorial, but also the dispossession and settlement that occur through the body of animals and plants that are now recruited to this ecological warfare, as I refer to it in the book. So this dual project, settlement dispossession, happens through dual strategies. On the one hand, sovereign power, on the other hand, this biopolitics, this takeover through animal and plant organisms. And both of them together, I refer to as settler ecologies. And I argue that settler ecologies perpetuate violence not only toward non-human lives, but also toward human lives. And that these two forms of violence, to the human and non-human, are not only co-produced, but also exacerbate one another. So we are talking about the exchangeability and the interconnection between those forms of violence as I record them as a legal ethnographer. So most of my work I've been doing in-depth interviews and observations with the Israel Nature Protection Authority, and this is their logo. This has been at this point almost 100 in-depth interviews, but probably a decade or more long, and some of them relations that go back 30 years to my work as an environmental lawyer in that space, in that region. So the territorial aspect of, well, I'm speaking a little bit to the territorial aspect, and then I'll move to speak to the more biopolitical and versatile project of protection and dispossession through protection of animal and plant bodies. So this is a map by the Israeli government. So you see that there's, it can be quite controversial here. There's no inner boundaries, there's no occupied territories, but there are green spaces, and those encompass some 25% of the landscape. And that's a huge amount that is actually designated as a nature reserve, already designated as a nature reserve or national park. And the project is ongoing, swiftly accelerating, in fact. So the state of Israel has currently about 530 national parks and nature reserves, and that's also a massive amount. Yeah, even if you compare it to much larger spaces such as South Africa, where I just came from, where there's about 20 national parks. One of them, Kruger, is the size of the state of Israel. And so we are talking about, we can talk about that later. Why is Israel so into these, what I call is almost an ecological state? And so it boasts those immense amounts of nature reserves and parks. And I only focus on just a few of those in my book as examples. It was very difficult to decide which ones, and I'll show you which ones I chose to work on later. But just a few qualifications. I'm not claiming here that all of Israel's nature reserves and national parks were designated with a single goal of dispossessing Palestinians. What I am saying is that dispossession is definitely a central part of the story and has thus far been quite neglected in the literature, especially when it comes to the area of 1948 Israel. So we can't really see that area here, but I will show you a map later. So as far as I'm aware, this is the only or the first comprehensive study of the state of Israel's nature conservation project through a settler colonial lens. This is not usually the lens through which such studies are conducted. But Israel is not the only country that has used national parks and nature reserves. You might be familiar with other political geographies that utilize this form of dispossession toward local native and indigenous populations. And also another qualification, such dispossessions of local and indigenous native people also take place outside of the space of nature reserves and national parks and happen through other strategies, other contexts than wildlife protection. But those are not my focus in this particular project. So my focus is when it does happen through the lens of nature, so-called nature protection. Once the state designates a space for protection, this particular space, this land, is typically then subject to numerous restrictions. So in those cases where the land was privately owned, the owners would often be prohibited from cultivating, or in some instances, even from accessing those private lands. Even though they continue to be their private lands, they do not usually get compensation, or they're not usually awarded compensation for this act of designation to a nature park or a national reserve. And of the various parks that I was telling you, 530, my work focuses in detail on 3 areas. One in the northern part, in the Mount Meron area. Actually, it's probably somewhere here. The other part is the national parks in the area, in the central area of Jerusalem. So the one in Mount Meron I start the book with, and that's kind of in what's called 1948 Israel. It's within the green line. So it's what the international community actually accepts as the sovereign space of Israel. The central part is a part that Israel has annexed in 1980 and says, well, this is my sovereign territory, but the world does not usually, with some exceptions, acknowledge that annexation. And then the third is in the occupied Palestinian territories, Wadi Kana. So those 3 are already in 3 different legal regimes, and I go into that a little bit in the book. However, I will say already now that my claim is that there is one unified settler colonial regime that governs all of them, despite the differences in the particularities of the regions. I'm going to show you a few images just to give you a sense of how the space looks like, since we're talking about landscapes and takeover of landscapes. So Mount Meron, this is it. You can see that actually what you're seeing here is a Druze village, a non-Jewish Druze village, and 20% of the land designated as the first nature reserve in the Upper Galilee, Mount Meron, that was designated in 1964. It actually encircles this village, this Druze village, and basically suffocates it because it cannot expand, because those lands, 20% of them owned privately by these Druze, stifle its growth. All right, so here's a traditional Druze farmer still cultivating his land in the reserve. I'm moving swiftly to the area of Jerusalem just to give you a sense how it looks like. This is a national park. And this is the national park called in Hebrew, the translation City of David, or in Arabic, Silwan. And another one is Walaja. These two national parks are my focus in the third chapter of the book. You can see in the background the separation wall kind of dividing space, and I do speak about that kind of that project as part of how humans and non-humans move in the landscape. All right, and finally, this is the Wadi Kana Nature Reserve in Area C, which is under both military and civil control of Israel. This is how the space looks like. Quick comment about the scholarship. I draw on settler colonial scholarships, specifically in Palestine, also elsewhere, critical animal studies, environmental history, and also political ecology. So within the settler colonial literature, there has been traditionally this division between colonialism and settler colonialism. And showing basically the claim is that that exploitation is more characteristic of colonial societies, whereas elimination is the main characteristic of settler colonial societies. But in this project, I claim they go hand in hand. And while I challenge that kind of division in the canonical literature, I still very much find helpful some of the very strong foundations of settler colonialism. Specifically, what is helpful for my project is the immense focus of settler colonialism on the importance of territoriality, which is clearly very important here. The end goal of the natives' elimination, or what in settler colonial studies is usually called genocide, the genocidal goal of settler colonialism. And finally, I feel like this framework, using the settler colonial framework, however, it was not something that that a lot of people, it didn't resonate with some of my interlocutors. Let's put it gently. It still was helpful for me because it creates alliances with other settler colonial contexts. So here we're speaking about alliances between Palestinians and indigenous communities elsewhere, and I thought that was really important. And also this, like I said before, this overlying project of settler colonialism highlights the unifying aspect of the 1948 Israel in 1967. So whereas traditionally a lot of criticism toward Israel focuses on the 1967 occupation, here I expand the lens and I include the 1948 territories in the critique of the settler colonial state. So my critique is not limited to 1967 Israel. So you can see here, I did find finally, Israel does not use maps that include the Palestinian territories. So this is one of the maps I found. So, so here you do see the separation between these spaces. So I claim that the settler ecologies and the settler colonial project governs both spaces, despite the differences perhaps in the details. All right, so until now, I very briefly went through the more territorial aspect, that technology of dispossession and settlement. And now I want to kind of dedicate the rest of my minutes to speak about the other one, which is the dispossession through animal and plant bodies. And so since its earlier days, the Zionist project had promoted a strong affinity with wild animals, and especially with those wild animals that can be affiliated and connected to biblical species. So we're seeing, for example, this menagerie kind of like imagery of the, oh, so you can't see all of the titles. All right, I guess we'll contend with that. It says the biblical menagerie or something like that. Okay, so while Israel and the Zionists have come to be associated with certain species that need protection, and I will speak about 3 examples of that. The Palestinians have come to be associated with more, let's say, problem species, such as this black goat, camels, olives, hybrid goldfinches, and feral dogs. And precisely because these animals, these plants are typically not perceived as soldiers in human wars, when flora and fauna are deployed for ecological warfare, their alignment, I will argue here, or I've argued here, on one side or the other becomes that much more powerful. So in fact, ecological warfare is not recognized as warfare at all, nor as a conflict, but seems part of the natural order of things. And that's kind of what I say is the power of this type of warfare. As part of this ecological warfare, what we see is a juxtaposition, is basically between two-sided bifurcation. So fallow deer, gazelles, wild asses, griffon vultures are all recruited by the state of Israel to fight on the Israeli side against the goats, the camels, the hybrid goldfinches who are aligned with the Palestinians. Plants too are recruited for this ecological warfare. Some are uprooted, like the olive tree, and others, such as the akub and the za'ata, which are edible herbs used pretty widely in the Palestinian cuisine, are protected by the settler state. So you see two tactics here. Protection thus means that they cannot be, that there's restriction toward their foraging by Palestinians. So here, for example, images of children who were arrested for foraging the akub. Underlying these animosities are other deeper contentions. The domestic is juxtaposed with the wild, culture with nature, and finally the native and indigenous are juxtaposed with the settler state. And these juxtapositions lean on each other, reinforcing and therefore legitimizing the power and the seeming naturalness of the juxtaposed mindset that is so characteristic, I claim here, of settler ecologies. So the book really weaves in between several animal and plant stories in detail, and much nuance in detail. Those animal and plant stories embody and further the juxtaposition between the two sides. And I'm going to just very briefly share two examples so that you get a sense of the project. The first is going to be the war between the Asiatic wild ass. I take a lot of pleasure in speaking about the ass throughout the book. And the juxtaposition between the wild ass and the camel. And this wild ass, so that's the first example, and then I'm going to speak about the vulture, the griffon vulture. Okay, so the wild ass was identified and as a biblical animal, and as such, the fact that it was extirpated from the landscape, the first director of the Israel Nature and Parks Authority decided that it should be brought back, reintroduced in the conservation jargon back to the landscape. So some wild asses were discovered in Iran, brought to Israel, and in fact they did so well. It's considered one of the most successful conservation reintroductions in the world, and they became they populated the landscape so quickly that the reintroduction project stopped within 5 years. In fact, the Jewish farmers said, stop, start culling them because they're eating our crops. So now the population is about 350 individuals and counting. And that's all I'm going to say right now about the wild ass project. So the reintroduction happened in the Negev Desert, or Negev in Hebrew, in the southern part of Israel. And this is a photo I took just near the military base of Bad Echad in the Negev Mountain Nature Reserve. Now I'm going to complicate the story a little bit with a rivalry with a camel, right? This is Salman Sudan. And in 2017, the Israel Nature Protection Agency pressed criminal charges against him. For what, you will ask? He's a Palestinian citizen of Israel, a Bedouin as well, and his crime was that he allowed his camels to graze in the Negev Mountain Nature Reserve. This is one of the central habitats of the Asiatic wild ass. So he was also charged for allowing his camels to drink water from the water in the nature reserve. The problem, apparently, is that the wild asses are afraid of the camels and especially the pregnant ones, won't feel comfortable drinking the water when the camels are there. Therefore, he's seen as the enemy to the reintroduction project by actually allowing his camels to graze in. And there was this criminal case that I followed very closely. If you don't believe me, here's the number. You can go check. This is the first page of the case. So it was a really interesting case to follow because you all know that the camels are affiliated with the desert landscape and almost seem like even more natural there than the Asiatic wild ass. However, and they're also very important for the semi-pastoral Bedouin community. However, they've only been around for 3,000 years, but they're affiliated with human human domestication. They're affiliated with the humans. And so the idea here is this kind of classic idea of conservation that pristine wilderness does not include humans and their animals, and therefore they need to be separated, and therefore the camels should not be a strong part of the nature reserve. And the wild asses are preferable, and their needs are higher and prioritized over the camels. So this is part of this conservation tradition that displays nature as an unspoiled Eden. And historian Mark David Spence pointed out in the United States context that wilderness was not just there. It had to be made. And for that purpose, indigenous people, indigenous communities had to be displaced to be able to make this wilderness. And the same idea I claim happens here. So this idea of conservation about protecting nature from all of humans and their associated animals makes this project seem apolitical, right? Even if Abraham, the father of Judaism, would come on his camel to the nature reserve, he would be blocked by Inca rangers in the entrance, right? It seems like it's a very egalitarian project. However, the structural discrimination becomes more apparent when you realize that usually Jewish people are not actually grazing their camels. It's usually Palestinian Bedouins who are. So there's that kind of affinity between the Bedouins and the camels. So under settler ecologies, then the wild ass becomes a technology for altering the desert landscape back to an imaginary Jewish past that does not contain Bedouins, whose very presence in this landscape is like a thorn in the Zionist imaginary of an empty land or terra nullius. For the landscape to reappear in its wild imaginary, the Bedouins and the domestic animals that have come to be associated with their lifestyle must therefore be eliminated from the landscape of this place. I know harsh words. Okay, this was the juxtaposition. You see how it plays out, the juxtaposition between wild asses and camels here. Quickly, the next story, and I'll end with this story, is the Griffin Vulture story. There's a lot more in the book, but the Griffin Vulture project I end the book with, and I'm fascinated with this project because it actually also shows how the sovereign project can extend the boundaries of what usually people see as the Israeli state. And through the protection of the Griffin Vulture, we see imperial or colonial project expanding to kind of different and to different spaces. Then how does that happen? So thousands of vultures have filled up the skies in this region, but they shrunk recently to just about 70 breeding pairs, so a drop of 95%. So this is a legit conservation project, right? These are all legit and actually really important conservation projects. So the decline was as a result of electrocution, inadvertent poisoning, and also, of course, habitat loss. So in the 1990s, Israel Nature Protection Authority designed a captive breeding program. The idea was to coax the vultures to produce more eggs in the wild, then take the eggs in captivity, rear them, and reintroduce them later, or introduce them, to be more accurate. There's currently 220 Griffin vultures flying in Palestine-Israel, making the project a big success. Now, 80%, this becomes important, so 80% of these vultures are monitored by GPS. Okay, so these are the chicks. I couldn't resist, sorry. Something cute here. So GPS, this is how the GPS looks like when on the bird. And this is the alert system that Israel Nature Protection Authority uses to the cell phone of the rangers to alert them in real time when the vultures are moving in a way that is problematic or shows that maybe they're hovering over some poisoned carcasses, and they will go out there within minutes to save the vultures. This is how important this project is. So they're tracking them with this GPS. But as you can, okay, so birds. Birds serve as kind of usually in the conservation narrative, usually people say birds know no borders, and so conservation, the love of birds will know no borders either. And maybe working through birds, we can promote peace. And in fact, that's been kind of statements that have been sounded in this context, birds as peacemakers in this context, as you can see here. All right, so unsurprisingly, the slogan, okay, so this is kind of how the GPS monitoring looks like on the monitor of some of the ornithologists, right? So you can see this is the area of Israel, but now we're traveling into Egypt and all the way down here to Sudan and also all the way down to, say, Saudi Arabia. So certainly this conservation project has no borders in the sense that it exceeds the sovereign space of Israeli territory into Northern Africa and Saudi Arabia. And so here's another one. This is the one I use in the book to show to where the extent of the ornithologist kind of surveillance of the birds extends. Right? So perhaps it won't be surprising to you to hear that the slogan "Birds Know No Borders" is interpreted by Israel's neighboring countries as a green pretext for Israeli imperial control. And these countries have therefore not always seen Israel's intensive love of birds too favorably. So for example, in 2011, Saudi Arabia detained an Israeli vulture for spying. The vulture was carrying a GPS that said in Hebrew Tel Aviv University, which prompted rumors that she was a Mossad agent. I'm sorry that you can't see all of the titles here. This is another title from a griffon vulture that was detained in Lebanon. And here I had to include the dolphin, was also suspect in spying missions. And the Israel Nature Protection Authority dismissed all of these claims, of course, calling them ludicrous Arab fantasies. So I'm going to depart from these accusations of spying missions to say, toward wrapping up, that birds have been central to Israel's military in several ways, not just in these outside of sovereignty missions, but that Israel's military and its Air Force in particular have over the years developed an almost totemic relationship with birds, or maybe not almost, totemic relationship with birds, as you can see in some of these posters, where you can see produced by the Israel Air Force, we portray military aircrafts alongside the birds they are named and named after and affiliated with. So here are a few examples. With migrating birds know no boundaries, and the affiliation, the affinity between the military bird and the so-called natural bird. And my favorite one, I wanted this to be on the book cover, but press didn't think it was a good idea. So here, Israeli children and soldiers, you can see, participate in educational acts of knowing and protecting the land and its wildlife. But this is not only an environmental project in the sense that it's not only about land, or even it's not only about animals and plants who dwell on this land. It is additionally about the instrumentalization of nature for advancing the Zionist mission, a way to strengthen the ties between the ecological state, its land and creatures, and the Jewish children who will eventually become soldiers and finally serve, so to speak, both the state and its nature. So I will leave it here and look forward to your questions and to your comments.
Let me just ask, since I can't see the chat on Zoom, are people on Zoom able to hear? Is this microphone working, or is it just going through the computer microphone?
So there are microphones all around.
Okay,
you don't
so
need
people
that.
are able to hear. Okay, that's great. So thank you all very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. And I am very pleased to get the chance to meet Irus as well in person, since we have not done so. So I just wanted to start by reiterating the land acknowledgement that we heard earlier, and especially in the context of a book like this one. This is absolutely crucial to consider the lands that we occupy and to consider about all the historical and ongoing erasures that are part and parcel of that. So if we think about the connections that people have to territory, to plants and animals, and how those have been transformed over time and erased, I mean, that's the kernel of what is going on in the book. And so I think especially critical to think of those relationships in an ongoing way and in a critical way, as Irus invites us to do. University of British Columbia, where I live and teach, is on the unceded, occupied, and traditional territories of the Musqueam people. So again, this is something that we have to think very critically and carefully about. So, and I also just will start by saying thank you to all of the staff of the Gender Institute, Carrie and Megan and others, and Irus for making this possible. So let's think about, this is kind of in my way.
Yeah.
Am I shorter than you?
No, it was in my way too. I mean, you can stand anywhere you want.
Yeah. So here, I think Irus gave us a great summary of what some of the things are that are going on in the book. I'll try to highlight a few more things just to help you understand what's happening here, but I'll start by saying there's a lot happening here, and it's actually really worth a read. It's very readable, as Carrie said. And I kind of felt as I was reading that each chapter could probably be a book in its own right. There's so much richness of the data and the stories. So you can imagine a whole chapter just on the camels and asses story that Irus just told. But what's nice is that you have all of these different takes and lenses, different species from the akub to the zata to the camels, and each are sort of reflective, but all a little different in terms of the contextual and historic and legal specificities of each case. But here I think what Irus is showing us so brilliantly and in a lovely way, it's sort of devastating but lovely. If you read it, I think you'll know what I mean, is to think through these sort of ongoing complex acts of erasure and how all the time relationships between people, plants, and territory are being reconstituted, and the specific acts, whether it's military control, the shooting ranges, or the way that certain ecologists frame the benefits or damage of certain species over others. So I think that complexity and nuance comes out very well in the book. So we see the planting of particular types of trees that are favored, whether due to biblical narratives or other associations in terms of ecologies. We see the dispossession of Palestinians, Druze, and other communities from these landscapes and ecologies that they've long loved and benefited from and lived with. So one of the things that I like so much about the book is there's a lot of little wow moments where you're kind of a little shocked and amazed that actually something like that was said or documented. And there's a lot of the you can't make this up variety as well in terms of the way that these things come together. So the different stories, as I said, are really compelling and also kind of heartbreaking, but really just moving and also very readable. So it's painful, but in a way that I think is enjoyable, oddly enough. So despite the heavy insights, I think all of you will enjoy reading it. Okay, so Irus, thank you for writing the book and your decades of work to sort of bring this together. I did an early project where I was looking for all political ecological work I could find on the Middle East. That was some time ago. I pulled together an interesting bibliography, but nowhere near where we are today. And I think a book like this really brings home the types of things we should be thinking through in diverse contexts. So the Middle East, political ecologies of the Middle East are a little bit late to the game, but at least we have some great examples now, such as this book. So I'm going to give my comments through a couple of concepts that Irus develops and offers through the book. So one is thinking about ideas of the more than human, animal worlds. Another is difference and otherness. And one will be the tensions and ambivalences that Irus draws on throughout the book. And another concept will be resurgence and resistance. So the key concept, there's many actually, as I just said, but one of them is settler ecologies. So Irus offers this concept and works through it, thinking about a range of issues around settler ecologies, from ecologies of movement, which animals can move, which cannot, and how that plays out. Issues of green and blue grabbing. There's a lovely chapter that she's also written about elsewhere in terms of springs and how those get enrolled again in sort of sites of recreation, even though they're in Palestinian territory and often on Palestinian private lands. There's all the connections, as she just showed us, around animal studies and more than human worlds. And militarization is a big theme of conservation, which echoes in the broader political ecology of conservation literature and puts them into conversation. So let's start by thinking a little bit more about settler ecologies. So to quote Irus directly, quote, settler ecologies helps to highlight the ways in which the Zionist settler state administers nature to restore the Jewish presence in the landscape while dispossessing Palestinians in particular. But as I said, there's also other dispossessions that play out as well. These settler ecologies, as she's just described, operate through two major and interrelated technologies and dispossessions. The first being the enclosure of space in the nature reserves,
And the second is the necropolitical and biopolitical governance of more than human bodies. So I think that that overview actually addressed that quite well. So I won't go into a lot there. But my comment and question about the sort of ideas of settler ecologies is that this is, as Irus mentions, this draws on a lot of other associated concepts that have been around for some time in terms of thinking about the relationships between coloniality, colonialism, conservation, or ecology. And some of the richness, I think, is in this way in which we can think about the situation of Israel-Palestine in relation to what's happening, for instance, with indigenous territories and people in sites such as Canada or Australia. So Braverman's directly in conversation with people such as Zoe Todd and others who are writing on those contexts, but indirectly in conversation with a number of others. So I was thinking of the work of Michelle Daigle, Robin Wall Kimmerer, which has become very popular, and a lot of people have read Kimmerer's work on relationships to plants and diverse species and ecologies and how that is forced to shift through migration and dispossession, Kyle Powes-White and others. So in each of these sites, if you're looking at what is happening in these sites, of course, they're always very historically and contextually specific. You know, what is happening in one indigenous context is very dissimilar to others. But when you read this book and when you read those other authors in conversation, you see these same echoes over and over. And how is it and why is it that there can be so much resonance between what's happening with indigenous communities in Canada, losing maybe access to wild berries or salmon and other protein sources that they historically relied on, how that interfaces with ideas of conservation and also just colonial dispossession writ large, different legal frameworks, and so forth. So I think one of my first questions for you is just to think a little bit more, maybe out loud or brainstorm, or where are you potentially interested in thinking more about those resonances and what that allows us to say about settler colonial logics and practices writ large. How do different theories and concepts travel? And I see Irus's book is bringing largely the Palestine-Israel context into direct conversation with those other literatures and authors. And I just wonder too, are there other things that are going on in that settler colonialism literature that might be really interesting and relevant to think through here? So for instance, I was thinking around conversations around indigenous ontologies and all of those conversations which are becoming louder and very live in some of these other indigenous contexts. So that issue and tension between the necessary specificity of those practices and dynamics, but also these shared resonances, and how can we think about that in ways that are fruitful. And I think you highlight again when you cite some of those authors that this sounds a lot like what's happening in these diverse contexts, but I guess I'm also interested in thinking about the multi-sided nature and how we definitely bring those together. So here I'm thinking, if any of you have read the Kimmerer book, a lot of people have, a lot of people love it. It's also a lovely, well-written work. But, you know, when she talks about the connection in her youth to the wild strawberry, or the connection to the pecan, and then how with dispossession and forced migration, indigenous peoples are forced to think through and live differently in relation to these complex ecologies that are so much a part of their life and their community and their diet and other cultural practices and identities. And so again, this is similar to what Irus is describing in terms of how the camel links with the Bedouin communities, or how different Palestinian harvesting of the zatar and the akub, how these are deeply cultural practices that connect people to the territory and landscape, part of their culture and their diet, and how those transitions affect senses of self and community. So again, in terms of other resonances that are here, Irus talks about terra and animal nullius, as already mentioned. Dynamics around racism, you might say, or the severing of people territorial relationships. So again, what are the broader theoretical or conceptual insights that we might take from that? Or what are you really hoping those other communities, elders and scholars might hear or understand from your work in terms of thinking about conservation, settler ecology, or relationships with territory and wildlife and plants differently or similarly? So I would love to see a panel with Irus and some of those other scholars, and I don't know if it's happened already, but if it hasn't, we should hope it happened, because I think that would be a really rich and generative, amazing discussion to have. So you mentioned it too in terms of your introduction, Irus, in terms of the alliances that this might allow between understanding what's happening with Palestinian and other communities with these other indigenous contexts. And so a little bit more maybe thinking, what does that look like? Have you seen some sparks of that, or where would you hope that might go, whether politically or conceptually? So this book does a lot of things, and it does a lot of things extraordinarily well. And I don't just say that as your guest, like I accepted the invitation not having read the book, knowing that I would probably like it. And you know, I loved it because it has every page I think is worthwhile. It's not just that there's one chapter that's well developed. The entire book comes together well and is really well done. As I said, one of the things that I think the book does so well, and Irus kind of demonstrated for us, is this way in which human and non-human lives are intricately connected, and how these are remade through colonial practices and conservation practices. That is the kernel of how everything comes together in the book. So whether it's about the camel, the olive tree, the akubin, the goldfinch, the gazelles, the donkeys, the boars, the cows, the griffin vulture, all of these are dealt with care and nuance. They're the main characters, but you see all these complex entanglements throughout. So I agree, as Irus states, that this offers a fresh outlook for animal study as well. And I know a lot of my students are always looking for lovely examples of work that does as well. So this is one in terms of bringing these plants and animals debates about their protection together. So one of the tensions that's obvious, but I think really interesting to think through more, is whether or not this is a valued species, satar or nakub, that are being protected, or whether or not it's something that's seen as devastating to nature, such as the camel, or the way that the olive trees are being uprooted. The outcome nonetheless is the same. So both, whether valued or not, end up limiting the benefits and possibilities for those communities, notably Palestinians. So how do we come to understand that? What are the tensions therein, that whether or not a species is deserving of protection on behalf of the colonial state, or seen as detrimental for ecologies that are desirable, especially in the biblical narratives? I think I would love to just try and understand and think through that a little bit more. So the other thing that Irus thinks through is what she calls ecologies of movement, which is related to this idea of settler ecologies. And so this is very simply, even though that we have these discourses about animals that are able to move across borders and not have to think through those geopolitical contexts and the politics of Israel-Palestine in particular, if they're on their own volition, if they're flying, as you saw in those maps, that's the case. But if they're being transported by human counterparts, even if it's for their care and well-being and health, you know, there's significant obstacles that really affect which vultures are able to live and which vultures are able to die, given access to care or technologies or assistance. So here I think this is one of many examples, and the goldfinches is a really tough example to think through, because here a lot of goldfinches are smuggled in, prized by some in the Palestinian communities, but often then confiscated and killed by the authorities, who don't want them to mix with the wild populations of birds. So here, this is the example from Irus in terms of necropolitics and how that plays out in terms of which species can thrive and which are resigned to die. So in all those cases, we see how the health and safety of the animals is aligned very much with the borders, which plants and species are able to thrive and which are not. So in the conclusion of the book, Irus says, quote, "In small but significant ways, non-human lives will tell us what's going on for humans, if we care to listen. Alongside their central role in furthering settler colonial violence, more than humans can arguably show us the path towards subverting it." So this would be a key question. Can you say more? There, obviously, you're giving us a lead that we'd like to hear much more about the non-human and particular animal ecologies might subvert or help us decolonize settler ecologies. So another theme I just wanted to touch on is the theme of difference and otherness. We're here in this sort of feminist interventions series, excuse me. And so I'd like to hear more about the feminist directions in the work. So gender comes up at a couple moments. So in terms of the care of the vultures, you have the mother drone that feeds the vulture chick, the military men who pat themselves on the back for being excellent mothers as they feed the chick with their drones, and the hetero-inflected celebration when the father vulture returns to his home territory in Israel with a new mate. You have another moment where gender politics plays out, where women are being taught how to use the herbal plants properly and how to harvest them properly when they've been harvesting them for centuries. But what else might there be to say about gender? I'm just interested to hear your thoughts, even if it were things that were not your focus in terms of other directions or questions. How can we think beyond gender or sexual relations or heteronormative reproduction to think about other intersectional differences and inequalities? And again, that's essentially what the book is about. That's how it fits in this lecture series, because it's all about exploring difference, otherness, and how these settler ecologies create possibilities for Palestinians and Israelis in different ways, and how that's always articulated through the animal and plant lives as well. But I'm interested in thinking, what are those sort of concepts and theories from feminist queer theory or other intersectional approaches that might be useful to help us think about this? And I've mentioned this to our Irus earlier, but I also wonder what this can bring back to feminist theory. And there's still a bizarre gaping salience at times in feminist and intersectional theory around nature and critical politics of nature and ecological relations in general. There's some great work on queer ecologies and other work that's come online. I think feminist political ecology gives us lots of great examples, but I wonder, Irus, if you have any thoughts about this in terms of how this can inform some of our theorizing in feminist and other ways. And one of the obvious links to me is because of early ecofeminist work and notions of essentialism in some of that work, there's been a tendency to eschew those connections altogether. But I think reading Irus's book and also just thinking about feminist political ecology in general, it's high time we think about hierarchies and inequalities in a way that brings in nature and non-human others more adequately. And so Irus is helping us to do that, but I think I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of more that could be done, especially not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that essential insight in terms of how these hierarchies, that the violence against nature and human are linked, is something that early ecofeminists were basically trying to get us to think through. And we've kind of moved away from that in a way that I think is deeply problematic for our ability to understand processes of marginalization and power dynamics. So can we push a little bit more on the feminist and intersectional foundation and frontiers of this work in particular? I'll go quick to say one or two more things. Irus highlights these different tensions at different points in the book. So these are the different tensions between the domestic and the wild, the camel and the ass, and other things that kind of play in different ways through the book. So I'd love to hear more about how this works for you analytically and how you make use of those tensions. There was also a couple in there that I, especially now that I know you teach about property law as well, I was interested in the discussions around these lands are taken away or Palestinians are not able to access the springs, even though they're on Palestinian private property. So a deeper reflection on questions around what it means to cite and incite private property in a context such as Israel-Palestine, especially when we think about the Green Line. One of your Palestinian interlocutors said, it doesn't matter if we're speaking about 67 or 48, these are all occupied territories. So how does that play out? And as a legal scholar, I'm actually curious as to actually how is it that this Palestinian lands are taken and then people are not even able to access the public springs after that. So the final concept I wanted to think through and mention connects back to those debates from settler colonial literatures in particular, and that's the ideas about resistance and resurgence. So a lot of Indigenous scholars and thinkers are thinking more and more about resurgence. And indeed, some of this is connected to the health and well-being of particular plant and animal species. So I would love to hear more about, again, key pathways forward that you see in terms of Palestinian resurgence in this context, and to be able to answer the question more fully that you posed about what does it look like to decolonize settler ecologies in the context of Israel-Palestine, Palestine-Israel. So is there a way that we can think about conservation and biodiversity differently that eludes the grip of discriminatory settler ecologies, and so forth? The last point I'll say is actually about methods. So you said that this is a legal ethnography. You didn't set out to do a multi-species ethnography per se. You have some reflections on your positionality as someone who taught nature conservation in the military and other complex questions. But I think your book actually serves as a really interesting model for critical allyship and how to think through that. So I would ask you as well, is there anything more generally you would say to other people working on anti-racism, anti-homophobia, decolonization, that you can say about how you work through your privilege and changing deep-seated assumptions and how that plays out in the context and how that informs the work and what you're able to bring to it. There's also some really interesting ways in which you're doing critical interdisciplinary work. You talk about how different leaderships want different things from you. So again, any ideas on how people can navigate those tensions, I think you'd be a great person to teach us more on those avenues. So I can restate my questions if you want, or else I can just sit down and see what you'd like to speak to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. That was so, I will say, it's been, this is really one of my first times speaking about the book as a whole. It's as part of it being such a controversial ethnographic project. I kind of feel like I was wary of making it public too early. Because of prior projects where making things public meant that some of my interlocutors would pull out their agreement for me to utilize materials. So maybe, and coming to it from the end of your comment, I'll take my sweater. Okay, so maybe we'll just start to respond to some of these things and then we'll open it up.
That sounds
perfect. Yeah,
that would be great.
because I kind of feel like I'd much be so interested. Like I said, this is one of the first times, maybe third time I'm presenting the project as a whole, and definitely in my home institution. I'm really honored by this opportunity, and I would like to hear thoughts and not just talk. But I will say, all right, so. The gender thing, you're gonna have to deal with that, yeah. No way around it. I've been asked about this. I remember with my choral project too, because I interview these powerful women scientists, and in fact, like underlying the project was a lot of gendered aspects in science. But it was not explicit in the book, and that was the first question I was asked by NPR on like live radio, and I was like, gender to do with the story. But of course it did. It had a lot to do with the story, but I guess I do have my own aversions to work through and traumas. So whereas it is very much part of the story, and I will say the whole nature conservation project in Israel is very male. I mean, all the rangers I spoke with are all men. When I asked about it, well, there's women fighting in the Israeli army. Why can't there be women rangers going to nature reserve? They're like, well, it's a very hard job. So the idea, I can speak a little bit more about the so-called dangers in working on the frontier with all the natives, assaulting and etc. That kind of imaginary of the Palestinians is perhaps being dangerous and such, and why there's no women rangers assigned, but definitely apart maybe from two women interlocutors, one working on oceans, rather interesting. So the woman was working on the ocean and kind of the womb-like, aspect of that perhaps it's a bit of an overstretch. And then there was another woman working on plants. But definitely a lot of the rangers that I was working with, and the chief scientist. Also, this reflects the fact that the rangers and Israel Nature Parks Authority generally is a quasi-military organization, and the strength of the military comes through throughout the project. A lot of these officials have been trained in the army. I mean, most Jewish Israelis go through the army, but a lot of them have proceeded through the hierarchy of the army and then kind of jumped ship to nature. And the military nature relationship is pretty strong, not just with the affiliation in the personnel, but also in terms of land. So 50% of nature reserves, and I didn't mention that, and I don't know that we mentioned it, are all at the same time military zones as well. And that really strong correlation is not incidental. So there are some conservation assumptions about lands being without humans. Those are the lands that are protected in the periphery. That's where also the military can train such a small space. But there's also things that are beyond that, that go beyond that in the relationship between nature and the importance of nature in the military mindset. And I go into that in the book, the importance of loving the land in order to die for it. And so those kind of national nature narratives that emerge. So maybe that's just a very short way to start talking about gender and militarization. Yes, I do speak about it in the context of some of the animal species. It was so obvious when it came to the vultures and the happiness about the mother and father vultures. And remember, Emily, you and I kind of, it was a bit about the mother drone thing was like so incredible. So some of the materials were just too good to be true. I mean, there was like, gosh, you couldn't make it up for a movie if you wanted to. Like, it was like so rich in the context of like, so now the drone will become the new mother when the mother was electrocuted and the father was left alone to care for the chick. So the military generals come with their drone to be the new mothers of the chick. Well, a lot of really interesting associations there. I'll put the gender thing aside to speak about, I think, one question that has been nagging me for the entire project, and that is in the title of the book and really the essence of the project. So when I'm speaking about settling nature, it highlights the settler properties of the project, and this is really the essential aspect of this project is that it's a documentation of the settler story in a way, from a very critical perspective, but from my privileged standpoint of being a settler myself and being able to settler in the wide sense of an Israeli Jew. So not settler in the maybe more media related sense where people think about settlers just being the ones living in the occupied, Jews living in the occupied territories, but settler in the broader sense that I utilize here. So as a settler myself, I was also encouraged by Palestinian colleagues to use that privilege. Sometimes I felt uncomfortable doing that because I felt like I was maybe reinforcing or strengthening some of the narratives by focusing on the settler narratives, but at the same time, I felt uncomfortable being the one to speak about what the Palestinians should be doing or how they should be unsettling or speaking, doing the Palestinian project when I'm not myself Palestinian. So yeah, it was a constant tension for me from my kind of affinity with and work with Palestinian friends, colleagues, scholars, and sometimes being frustrated that what I'm documenting is stuff that I kind of was very troubled by sometimes, you know, and some of the interviews caused me a lot of ethical dilemmas, whether I should even show up to interview some of these people, some in the actual occupied territories in areas that I have not visited since I was in the army. And so that was always an issue for me. And until the very end, I wasn't even sure that I was going to even publish the book because of that reason. I was constantly very aware that I didn't want to undermine the indigenous narrative by focusing on the settler narrative. So the way that I worked with that is that I made sure to work very closely with Palestinian colleagues through the process, to quote intensively from that literature, and also to maybe bring a stronger voice into my interpretation of some of the interviews. In a lot of places, when I do ethnographic work, I let the narrative stand, and I don't necessarily bring my own voice. And here, in some places, I felt compelled to make a much stronger claim about some of the quotes that I bring that felt that I was very uneasy with, and I wanted to express that unease, so it's very clear where I stand, rather than being kind of in the abstract, kind of, neutral position of just being interviewing, kind of. So I do take a pretty explicit stand. Again, something that I don't think my interlocutors will like necessarily very much, but I hope at least they can respect that, because hopefully this is something that I'm still hoping will do, that it will maybe challenge some of the conservation folks. A lot of them really good people and also progressive and anti-occupation, et cetera, to start looking at their own practices from this lens, because a lot of them don't see the common aspects, don't see the several colonial aspects behind the work. So to come back to your question, you came back to it a few times. So how to unsettle, what does decolonial conservation look like? Well, that is really not what I'm doing here. I mean, I do plant those seeds because I feel like in order to get there, you kind of have to go through understanding what settler ecologies are, but I don't go there in this project. I do at the end give a story, the story of the Palestinian zoologist that actually takes power over a conservation project that he wants to define. And I see it as perhaps showing toward, like showing a light, or how do you say, shining a light in that direction. But I made a choice that I have to stick to the unpleasant project of unraveling some of the settler assumptions. And that was something that required a lot of focus. And so that was the focus of this project. Now that also comes to the comparison with other projects, other settler colonial projects. So that was, for me, it was very helpful to draw on the literatures in various contexts, because I would be like, wow, so many similarities. But, and this is another thing where I debated, like how much to put from that, because sometimes it would take away from the positionality or the place that I was working on. I would jump to South Africa, I would jump to Mozambique, I would jump to like different contexts, and it felt, and so finally I just put a lot of it in the conclusion, in the introduction, and sometimes in various paragraphs through the book. But this is not a comparative project, basically. What I do say, however, is that I feel like the concept settler ecologies is not a Palestinian-Israeli concept. It is an important concept that can be utilized and is important to utilize more broadly. And there has been literature that utilizes similar concepts like environmental colonialism, green apartheid, in various contexts. It has emerged in various concepts have emerged to analyze similar phenomena as those that I'm speaking about here. The reason I coin a new term, settler ecology, and I think you've asked about that a little bit, like, so how can this help in the conversation? I mean, in a way, it's a continuation of the other projects that I acknowledge and draw on, etc. But at the same time, I did want to highlight the hope aspect, because ecologies as a term, I use it in plural to indicate that there's not only one version of colonial thought, of conservation thinking, and that actually conservation can move beyond a colonial project. So I guess when I use plural, I use it in several ways. Number one, to indicate that the state ecology is not one. There were very many ecologies at work here. And to simplify it and say, well, there's one Zionist ecological way of thinking was just too simplistic. And I thought it would come back to haunt me. And so it was very important for me to show the diversity within the community that I was interviewing, even within those national parks that I showed you, like different officials had different stances, some of them protecting Palestinian foraging, going and prohibiting people working under them to go and arrest, like, so there was a plurality in the voices that I heard. And so that's one reason I used ecologies in plural, but the other one is again that I think that ecological thought, if used to Morton's concept, can be decolonized as long as we can become more aware of and more transparent about the settler colonial foundations of conservation thought. So on the way here, I was insisting with you that some of this nature culture distinction is really at the heart of colonial conservation, right? So I show it again and again in the book, how the camel can't be part of the reserve because it's not considered a natural, it's not wild, right? Same was with the olive tree, still uprooted in nature reserve because it's not considered a wild tree. And so this kind of purity still goes on, even though a lot of my interlocutors were much further ahead. They didn't necessarily submit to fortress conservation parks versus people models, but still you could see it playing out. So once you become aware of the dangers of that separation between nature and culture, you might be able to move beyond it, to allow humans to be part of a reserve, et cetera, to actually have them be part of conservation rather than alienate them from this project. I'll end here.
Very good.
Terrific conversation.
Linda, thank you so much for your generative comments and careful reading of this fantastic book. Let's open up the floor to commentary, feedback, questions in the remaining 15 minutes that we have. Marla?
I really enjoyed hearing about that. And I am absolutely new to this image, to this question. And so I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about settler ecology and you were talking about the wild assets and the camels, I could not help but think of Noah's Ark, right? And to think of that as a settler ecology. But it made me wonder, what kinds of discourses are tied together in the settler ecology as it is implemented in, Palestine-Israel, from what you saw? Like, what are the different discourses that come together in it?
All of them. No, I'm asking, like, what do you mean? Can you narrow down?
So what kinds of discourses come together in, say, deciding which animals should stay and which should not?
Oh,
Or what kinds of,
yeah, that goes to your question.
Right.
That I did
There's
before.
so many answers to that, but one of them, is the return of Jews to Israel is linked with the return of the animals from the same time period. So it's about how people and landscape are associated. So you have to bring back the landscape in a way that will allow people to be connected to the territory. But also all the things that you were saying too about the nation and loving the nation. You have to love the territory. You have to be able to fight for the nation, but there's so many other things that could happen.
right, and I wonder if kind of Talmudic ideas come into it, like, the stuff about the mother bird and the baby birds, right? I mean, I'm just wondering if those things get
Another chapter.
Yeah.
There we go. I'd be curious.
if they get integrated into, public discussion on it, or even kind of the construction of the ideals that guide the projects.
Interesting. So here you can see in action the difference between the diaspora Jews who are related to Talmudic text and the very secular conservation community in Palestine-Israel. Most of the now this is where it comes to the ecologies and the plurality of the community. Most of the rangers and the conservation officials are very secular, and so they might not even know what you're talking about. And however, there was a strong, more religious community of rangers and professional officials in the Jerusalem area. And that's where the biblical landscape and the landscape of the forefathers comes back to life very strongly, with their idea that the terraces that are now being preserved by the Palestinian laborers are actually not really of the Palestinians, they're actually of our Jewish forefathers. And so the Palestinians are basically just workers that continue the same tradition, and they're allowed to stay there as long as they maintain the biblical landscape. But once the landscape becomes so-called, I'm quoting from them, a refugee landscape and looks like a refugee camp, then it needs to be demolished, eliminated, so that the landscape can become that landscape of milk and honey, of terraces and springs. And so there is a project, as Leila was pointing out, of remaking the landscape in the imaginary of how it supposedly looked like. And for that to happen, a lot of times, so here's an example of where sometimes the exploitation of the Palestinians goes hand in hand with their elimination, so they can continue to work the terraces and cultivate the landscape as long as they do it in the very traditional way, but not if they're trying to do it differently. So there's a bit of a romanticization or Orientalism toward the native.
And they're being turned into stewards of traditions that may or may not be theirs, but they're kind of reduced to the
Yeah, the
stewardship.
same landscape that they're
Yeah.
cultivating, the same narrative is used for their own elimination. So,
Yeah.
so once they have to build houses in that space because they don't have where to expand to, then the houses are demolished, or they themselves do not have permits anymore to stay in those regions because of different legal tactics in order to bring down, restrict the Palestinian Jewish, the Palestinian population in Jerusalem, for example. But so the Palestinians are not allowed to build and sometimes to cultivate and access their own lands in this nature reserve, and what I kind of document, which is really interesting. So they want to preserve the landscape, but not allow the Palestinians to be part of that project. This is the chapter about Jerusalem makes that very, very clear.
My question links in with Marla's to some extent, which is, to what extent does taking stock of the affective work that nature does, is that a part of your project? So I'm thinking of like forests as you're driving, like the planting of forests to hide the ruins of villages that were, and as you're driving along the road, all you see are the trees, and it's lovely. It's not a wall that's blocking your vision. It's a beautiful living forest that to the untrained eye, that's all that you see. So is there anything in this, in what you're tracking here that centers on, it's not just allowing or enabling displacement or settling, but it also provides its own narrative, some of it in what we've just been talking about, but some of it is also in the affective register of providing an experience for Jews of providing an experience of nature that covers over the sort of settling work that nature is doing.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. I love the effective aspect. I didn't put it that way, but it exactly is what I'm saying, really. And in fact, my entire doctorate is about the afforestation project by the Jewish National Fund. And really this book is a continuation of that project, because I show here how the forests, I mean, it's an ongoing story, and the forests, in order for them to be planted, the goats needed to be eliminated because the goats ate the forests. And so, but then they realized the forests are not good because the pine trees actually take over, and then now there's fires, and because now the goats have been eliminated, Palestinian goats, now there's nothing to protect from the fires, and now the goats need to be returned, and the forests need to be become a little bit less monocultural and so
an ecological take on
an
woolly
ecological-
right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I use Mulayawat in which is a book by Yoshua, a novelist, where he speaks about the ranger who at the end goes and actually burns the forest that he himself was there to protect. And that was a very insightful book for my doctoral project. It turned into my first book in English, Planted Flags. And so, yeah, here the context of both plants and animals takes on this kind of really almost, I don't know, like sometimes I would see it as like almost a festival of colors and animals, and they are like, but they change significance sometimes, and they change sides, and you kind of need to follow the story very, very closely. For example, the olive tree was just elected by the Jewish National Fund as the new Zionist tree. And you're like, whoa, this is just an explosion. This is the same tree that was just uprooted for so many years for being the unnatural tree. And now it's, oh, and now Jewish Israelis are cultivating that tree. And there's these contested themes about who, and still the olive oil is sold here on Hurdle Ave from, from the Palestinian land, and the importance of the olive oil and that connection to the land. So anyway, I'm just saying that that a lot of these symbols also change and take on more meaning as they go along and almost become bigger and bigger and more powerful and more powerful. And I exactly claim that the naturalization of this entire project has this element of hiding that powerful fact, so that it seems to be almost like the background, whereas that's where a lot of the war happens, where people don't even realize, and I described in, I think it was in my first book, where like I was doing my doctorate abroad, and when I came is when I first saw it, because I was away from the landscape a little bit, and it didn't seem obvious to me anymore. Why are there pine trees here and olive trees there? And like suddenly I saw the landscape itself as a site of war, but it's not happening through humans warring, but it's happening through these other affects, as you so beautifully put it. So yes, I think that's how the hidden aspect of it definitely is really important for the story I tell here. But that's maybe also a key out, because those participants, they're not necessarily willing participants in this war, right? They suffer from it, from these violences, and sometimes they resist it too. So then here comes the multi-species thing, right? Like, so sometimes those animals that are reintroduced, they don't want to be reintroduced. They want to stay at the zoo where they have a good time and somebody's feeding them, and they don't want to be eaten by the feral dog. Like, so sometimes those so-called pacifist participants, they come and they kick back the wild boars that are not seeming to recognize where they need to stay and who they need to attack, but are kind of taking over. So a lot of these stories are pretty incredible in how they kind of laugh back at some of the plans that the humans are orchestrating for them in this area.
Hannah Jin has a question online, going back to the issue of gender. I was curious if you had a chance to interview Palestinian women as part of the project, and if so, do the women raise unique concerns as compared to Palestinian men?
Yeah, I got that question also I think it was in Stellenbosch. Again, I will say my central project is not to interview Palestinians. This is a project that highlights the settler aspect of ecologies, but I did actually interview quite a few Palestinians in this story, and one of them is a Palestinian female lawyer who's been pretty strong also in the back of the book. Kamal, I see that you're there, or at least you were there. You're not asleep yet, so hi. I don't know if she's still there. So Kamal Mashilke Asad has been so amazingly supportive through this project, herself Palestinian female lawyer, dealing with a lot of these land claims, and together we worked on some of these issues. And so yes, definitely a lot of her insights helped me a lot through this project. She may have gone to sleep. She's still there? No. Oh, it's recorded. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for this fascinating project. I'm looking forward to reading the book. My question is about knowledge production. How is expert knowledge of ecologies or wildlife, like preservation, mobilized, and when? And does knowledge develop to serve the settler colonial project?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and this goes also to one of the questions I think that you asked. I can't remember like where I was going in my head when I, but that is about the connection here. The naturalization happened. Oh, the North Arc thing. Yeah. So that's a really interesting question, because that's an image that the biblical zoo in Jerusalem has been using a lot, like Noah's Ark and the reintroduction of animals that have been extirpated, and we're bringing them back. And so it was really interesting to interview the veterinarian of the biblical zoo. And I call her the female, here we go again, gendered stuff. I was meaning to write a whole thing about that. So she's the female, she is the new Noah's Ark. I call her the Neely Ark. So her name is Neely Avni Magen, and she is the one who was in charge of the fallow deer reintroduction. So she's the one I kind of followed around for so many years. Thank you, Neely. And that's so for Neely, for example, again, secular Jew, she knows about the biblical stories, but those are not necessarily so significant. So for her, in terms of the reintroduction of the fallow deer, it's not because those were biblical animals. For her, well, that's a nice story. It might give us some money, donations from American Jewry or whatnot, but for her, it was a cosmopolitan conservation project on a global level. And that was really interesting to see how a lot of this discourses are importantly global conservation discourses. Some of vets that I interviewed in other contexts told me they went to see how the wild ass reintroduction happened in Israel because they weren't going to do it in Mongolia as well. And so as it happened, I was working with vets in different contexts and knew some of the successful strategies that were developed here. So a lot of this expert knowledge is expert knowledge of conservation management, and it's promoted in that vein, and sometimes really despite the local aspects of it. So a lot of this is, well, we need to save species that are becoming extinct all over the world, such as, bird species that are migrating through this region, like 500 million a year. This is a major migration route. So we have to be here to protect the birds. We have to send people to protect them elsewhere. So there was a lot of that going on. However, less, I think, awareness to the sensitivity, the political sensitivities of these projects, of seeing themselves as leaders in conservation, as doing it better than everybody else, and almost being the light on the goyim, the light to all the other people, the best, in doing it, and what that implies politically and situationally in this context. So yes, all of this is really about unblackboxing some of the expert knowledges that come into play in the science of conservation in this particular context.
Just tying back to the earlier question about the imaginaries too. I mean, one of the things that's those moments in the book which are so crazy are the plot twists around when the olive tree changes, or when they talk about, the deer as being local to this place, endemic to this place, but then everyone thinks it's a deer. But then you find that it's actually connected to species from Northern Europe, but they have these different narratives about which ones belong, right, based on these senses of endemism and other things and biblical narratives. And then that, the other types of goldfinches, shouldn't be there because they're not from that place. But
They contaminated,
yeah, they
right? There's a
contaminate.
laminated.
Yeah, but then there's also a lot of the species, they're breeding with zoo populations in Europe as well, to bring back some of these species. So there's all the different ways expert knowledge is tied in particular ways to imaginaries around, what are the appropriate species for this context. Which those are, especially when they flip, which they did several times in the book, it's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, the flipping moments are moments of realization of how constructed some of these narratives are. And yeah, the goat is an important moment too. The goat was the enemy of the state, right? Yeah, the goat is the enemy, right?
Fire ecologies.
Right, yeah.
Well, let's continue this with the reception outside, but thank you both for the